And I can see Hannah participants joining us now, so I'll just wait for a few minutes. Hi, everybody who's joining us right now. We're just waiting for participants to enter the room. The number's climbing. We have a lot of people participating. And Bev Gillespie, Hannah, just sent you a note from Cape Town saying that she loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
I was surprised with your, as we were just waiting for people to come in, when I first found out about your book, I did a quick search on the internet thinking I'd probably have to order a copy and it would take a few days. And to my surprise, there was one sitting in one of our local bookshops in Victoria.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all the way over here. So,
oh, fantastic. Yeah, I know it was published in the UK and Commonwealth, so I think it's available in a sort of weird array of places across the world. I think you can find it in India and Australia and Canada.
Yeah, no, it came out, and I'm hoping, well, with my version is paperback, or it's like a strong, it's not a hard cover.
Okay.
It's more of a paper cover, but it's a large book. I mean, I can kind of hold it up here, there.
I've not seen the paperback version yet, actually.
Yeah, it's real. Have sales, while we're just waiting for guests to join us, have the sales been quite good overall for you?
I actually don't know. Appallingly. Yeah, it's something that I need to ask the publishers. But I find it quite hard to gauge what is good because, dispiritingly, actually, most non-fiction books don't sell that many copies. It's certainly not going to be a 50 Shades of Grey or a Harry Potter. So I'm not sure that's as good, to be honest.
Well, come to Canada, because if you can sell, I think 5,000 copies, it's classified as a bestseller.
Really? There you go. Yeah.
There you go.
Incredibly low, right?
Right. So I see we've got quite a number of people now that have joined us. So let's kick off. And for those joining us today, I mentioned to Hannah that this is the first webinar that I've ever run. And so far, so good. So welcome. First of all, I'd like to welcome all the folks here today who are from the Canadian International Council and non-members as well. We've got an audience of close to 150 people tuning in today from around the globe. And if you happen to be Turkish and watching this morning, it's this morning here in Victoria. Merhaba ve hoş geldiniz. So my name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch on Vancouver Island. And I was also honored to be our defense attaché to Turkey from 2011 to 2014. I've been back to Turkey fairly frequently since leaving in 2014, and my last visit was in November 2019. And a few people that are listening in today, I had a chance to meet them in Ankara and Istanbul back then. I'd also like to welcome our guest this morning, Hannah Lucinda Smith, who is the Times correspondent based in Istanbul. Just before we get started, for those not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an expressed mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in the changing international landscape. I think what makes us different from many of the think tanks that you find around the world is that we actually have 16 branches located in Canadian citizens involving, located in Canadian cities involving some 1,500 Canadians who are deeply involved in political issues. You can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council. And I'm always happy to talk about our organization if you want to get in contact with me directly at cakilford@gmail.com. Now I'm going to be your moderator for today, and we're going to start with a little Q&A between Hannah and myself, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. And for this portion, we're going to use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen, and I will do my best to get to all of your questions. If we can't get to all of your questions, I'll certainly follow up with you in the days coming. And we're also recording this event, and we'll have it available if you would like to see it again. So we'll get started. As I mentioned, Hannah is the Times correspondent in Turkey, and she's been covering regional conflicts there, the 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, and of course, current Turkish political issues. And during her time in Turkey, Hannah has also reported from inside rebel-held Syria, on the front lines of the battle against ISIS, the Daesh in Iraq, and was also there when we saw the mass movement of migrants on their journey from Europe to Europe in 2015. And is also the author of Erdoğan Rising, The Battle for the Soul of Turkey. And I have to agree with Hugh Pope here that I found it one of the most enjoyable and readable books I've read on current events in Turkey and the region for some time. It's coming out in paperback soon, so if you don't have a copy, I highly recommend it. Hannah, welcome to CIC, and I thought today that we would start off by doing a little bit of scene setting, because I'm sure the audience would like to know a little bit more about you and how you ended up in Turkey. So I thought we could sort of take you back to that time when you were in the UK. There were events building in the region in Syria and Turkey, and you headed off to Antakya in 2013. Could you let us know how all of that unfolded?
Sure. So I guess I came into Turkey through the back door. I never actually came to Turkey kind of expecting or wanting to be a Turkey correspondent, but what I did want to do was to report on the war in Syria. So at that point in 2013, I was 29. I'd been a journalist since I left university when I was 21, but I didn't work in newspapers. I worked in television. Initially, I was a television producer. I worked on British television programs, kind of investigative journalism programs. But I really wanted to write, and I really wanted to do foreign reporting. So back then in 2013, which feels like a really long time ago now, obviously the Arab Spring was kind of, I would say, coming to the end of its opening act. You know, we'd seen the revolutions in Libya and in Egypt and Tunisia. And I'd been watching these from the UK, sort of getting serious FOMO, like feeling like I really wanted to go and report on it, and reading about other young journalists who'd just kind of taken their chances and gone and had, you know, found amazing stories and built amazing careers. So it reached a point in early 2013 where I thought, okay, I'm going to try and go and do this with Syria. So at that point, there was still a kind of way that journalists could get into Syria, which was through Turkey, and particularly through border crossings close to Antakya and close to the city of Gaziantep, which is a bit further to the east. So I went there initially. I was going to go for like 4 or 5, 6 weeks, base myself in Antakya, go in and out of Syria a bit, see what was happening, see if I could sell some articles. And I did that, and I kind of got the bug. I got hooked on going and reporting in Syria, as weird as it sounds. You know, it was a really interesting story at that time. It was the point in time where, you know, what you might call the mainstream opposition, the Free Syrian Army, the opponents of Assad, was sort of being overtaken by the Islamist elements, particularly a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Al-Qaeda franchise, and then after that ISIS. So it was a really kind of interesting dynamic time in the Syrian conflict. So yeah, quite early on, after I'd first gone there, I decided to leave my flat in London to move to Antakya full time. And then almost as soon as I'd done that, Syria started getting really, really dangerous. So this was the point where journalists started going missing. ISIS started taking more and more territory from the mainstream rebels. As a Western journalist, particularly as a kind of, blonde woman who stands out a mile no matter what I cover my head with, it was becoming increasingly difficult to work there. So then I decided to move to Istanbul and kind of sit it out. I thought that maybe ISIS was going to be defeated and I could go back and report in Syria again. So yeah, in late 2013, I moved up to Istanbul, and really, really quickly, events in Turkey, I wouldn't say overtook events in Syria, but certainly for me, became the more interesting thing to look at, partly because of accessibility, but also because I started to get the sense that here was a country that until very recently was being lauded as a kind of democratizing country, a country that was going to be possibly an example to other Islamic countries in the region as a way where they could fuse Islam with democracy. And it was quite clear that something has started to go very wrong with that. So, gradually, although I kept sort of reporting on Syria from a distance and certainly kept my interest in Syria increasing, I started looking towards Turkey.
And I think what you were alluding there to was Gezi Park in 2013 when you arrived in Istanbul. If you could, I'd like to talk about Gezi Park, because it was such of concern at the time. I think it still resonates, and I'm not sure, some of our audience members may not be 100% sure about how Gezi Park all came about. But if I'm correct, it just began as a simple sit-down protest because of the urban development plan in Taksim, and then it morphed into something much, much larger. You were there on the ground at the time. How did that play out? And how did you find yourself running away from the tear gas?
Sure. Well, I think the same as you. I was actually based in Antakya still when Gezi happened. And what was interesting was, like you say, so it started in Istanbul. It started in Gezi Park, as the name suggests, which is a kind of small patch of green space in the middle of a vast expanse of concrete. So it's one of the few green spaces left in central Istanbul. And the government had come up with a plan to concrete it over and turn it into a shopping mall. And this initially sparked kind of small environmentalist protests. The environmentalist movement in Turkey it's there, but it's certainly not on the scale of anything that you might find in Western Europe or Northern America. But very quickly, it turned into something far bigger. This really triggered, I think, resentments that had been bubbling under the surface for a really long time. But the place that I witnessed it from was Antakya. And what was really interesting was that there were protests there. They were mainly, the protesters were mainly local Alawites they're Muslim. The main kind of Muslim group in Turkey is Sunni. Alawites are the same branch of Shia Islam as President Assad in Syria and his family. So it's a kind of different type of Islam, and there's a kind of long-held antagonism between the two, both political and more political than religious, I would say. So in Antakya, when the Gezi Park protests reached Antakya, it actually turned into something that was more about Syria. So the local Alawites, the Turkish Alawites, started protesting, and actually what they were also angry about was the influx of Syrian refugees into Antakya and what was happening over the border and what they saw as Turkey's support to the opposition to Assad. And interestingly, the people who I knew in Antakya at that time, because I was mostly working in Syria, were Syrian refugees who overwhelmingly were really quite keen on Erdoğan and not supportive of the Gezi protests at all. And also, you know, from where I was sitting, because I was reporting in Syria and I was seeing, you know, a really brutal crackdown, you know, an armed crackdown on what had started out as protests. When I looked at Gezi, and when other journalists who like me were reporting on Syria looked at Gezi, we didn't see it as so bad, actually. That was naive on our part. Of course it was that bad. Of course, you know, it really signaled a kind of breaking point in Turkey. But I think actually, you know, for me, it didn't really hit home what was happening during Gezi. It was 7 months later, in December of 2013, by which time I was living in Istanbul, when another round of protests broke out, which were to do with a corruption scandal which implicated several members of Erdogan's government, including Senator Erdogan and Erdogan himself. It was to do with Iranian sanctions busting. It looked fairly watertight. There was all kinds of evidence was leaked out, including a phone call between Erdogan and his son. And Erdogan responded by sacking a load of police chiefs, basically shutting down the case and pretty much purging his party of dissenting voices. And the protests in Istanbul over this were just, they were far beyond actually anything that I saw during Gezi. They were really, really violent. And I think this was the point where I really realized that something was going horribly wrong in Turkey.
One of the things, you know, you were there and I was there too at a very interesting, compact time with things happening. There was the reaching out to the Kurds, the PKK looking to a solution to that long-running conflict. There was the influx of all the Syrian refugees. There was Gezi Park. I mean, for anybody on the ground at the time, there was endless issues to be looking at to see how they would play out. I wanted to touch on the Syrian refugee situation as we know it today. We know that Turkey hosts roughly 3.5 million refugees. I know that label refugee isn't used in Turkey. They have another way of looking at or classifying people, but let's just say refugees for now. And I also read, I heard anyway, in the last couple of days that every day 500 Syrian babies are born to refugee families in Turkey. And I'm wondering, what are the perceptions like now over the last sort of 5-6 years of Syrian refugees? Because it just simply doesn't look like anybody is, quote, going home, as I think the Turkish government would have liked to have seen.
Yeah, no, I think you're certainly right. I mean, whenever people talk about kind of Syrian refugees, I always think about my ex-boyfriend. Actually, is one of the reasons why I stayed in Turkey at the beginning was because I was dating a Syrian, and he's kind of very, very typical of the Syrian refugees who arrived, I would say in sort of first waves in sort of 2012, 2013. He wasn't involved in the opposition at all. He was certainly no fan of Assad, but the reason why he left the country and left Damascus, his home in Damascus, was because he hadn't yet done his military service. He was imminently going to be rounded up to do it, and he didn't want to do it because at that time, if you were taken into your military service, you weren't getting out again. You were either going to carry on fighting or you were going to die. And in fact, I remember one of his friends, exactly that had happened. So a lot of young men left Syria at that time, and he's still here. Can he go home again? I know. I mean, I think last time I spoke to him was sort of 7 months ago, and no, I mean he can't go back. Even if there was an amnesty by the regime, he wouldn't trust them. You know, I think the sort of trust has been completely broken until Assad goes, if he ever goes. I don't think he could trust that regime. And equally, would he want to go and live in an area controlled by Islamist rebels? Well, no. I mean, he's a 30-year-old guy who likes drinking and likes, having a normal life. So, a lot of the, I think when people sort of talk about Syrian refugees or people who fled to Syria, they think, oh, maybe they've been involved in something political or whatever else. No, I mean, the majority are just people who were sort of living a life in Syria, weren't particularly political, sort of knew they had to keep their mouths shut about political things, found ways to deal with that, and were living their life. But then this thing happened and they had to leave. Now, in terms of kind of Turkish perceptions, you know, often the Turkish government will really try to play on how generous they've been to the refugees. And in some ways, yeah, they have. Certainly, Syrians live a lot better here than they do in Jordan or in Lebanon or in many places in Europe. I mean, you know, you want to see the kind of conditions that they're living in Greece, for example. But at the same time, I would say that the credit has to go to the Turkish people rather than the Turkish government. I think it's, you know, it's a sign of how welcoming the Turkish people have been overall, that there have been really so few incidents of kind of, you know, intercommunal tensions or violence. You get occasional stories about fights breaking out. You know, there's been a few occasions where Syrians have been killed by nationalist Turks, but they've been really isolated. And more often I've heard stories from Syrians of their Turkish neighbours being incredibly kind to them and helping them out. Now, on the other hand, there has also always been a section of Turkish society that has never been happy with Syrians being here. There is a kind of cultural clash, maybe I would say, between Turks and Syrians, although they're both Muslim countries. They're Muslim in very different ways. Obviously, Syrians generally are a lot more conservative. They speak different languages, which doesn't help a lot of the time. And, you know, as the years have gone by and as the numbers have got bigger and as it's become clear that a lot, if not most of those refugees cannot go back, and in tandem as Turkey's own economic situation has got worse, and, you know, for individual Turks, they're increasingly having problems finding work or paying their own bills, then the tensions have increased. So, you know, I think what's really interesting to look at is the change in Erdogan's rhetoric about the Syrians. If you look back to 2012, 2013, he would talk about the Syrian brothers. They're not refugees, they're our guests. You know, they can come, they're welcome, etc. And now what you'll see Erdogan saying is things like, well, you know, they're going to have to go back at some point. We're fighting to create a buffer zone where we can put X number of these Syrians into a buffer zone. And also, you know, increasingly Erdogan weaponizing those refugees. So what we've seen over the past few months where, you know, openly he's saying, I'm going to open my borders and send all these people to Europe. So, yeah, I think the position of Syrians has become a lot more precarious, even though, as I said at the start, when you compare their position here to their position in somewhere like Lebanon, it's a lot better. But it's not great. I mean, you know, there are some Syrians who've got Turkish citizenship, very small number, not many. For most, they're sort of, you know, surviving year by year, depending on getting their papers renewed by the Turks. There's been several occasions where there have been periods where papers weren't being renewed, so it meant that Syrians couldn't travel outside the province they're registered in. A lot of them don't have working permits, so they can't get over the table work. As you were saying about the Syrian babies, the number I heard actually was 100 per day, but it's certainly a lot. You know, if they're born to Syrian parents, those babies are not getting Turkish nationality, so they're stateless to all intents. I can't remember the exact proportion, but more than half of Syrian children in Turkey are not going to school. So yeah, I think this is really a kind of, you know, a time bomb issue for Turkey.
Once I unmute myself, there we go. Yeah, no, it's been interesting to watch. It's even you know, for us in Canada, we have taken in about 65,000 Syrian refugees. And another group of people that we have taken in, and we were discussing this earlier on before we went live, are Turkish refugees who have come to Canada. Asking for political asylum. And one of the figures I mentioned earlier on, over the last 3 years, from 2017 to 2019, Canada accepted 4,700 Turkish citizens as refugees in our country. That was the highest number from any country around the world, and quite surprising when you consider, of course, Turkey is a NATO member, it's an ally of ours, and we're granting political refugee for people. And you know, and we know where this question is going. It's tied to the Gulen movement. And not everybody accepted in this country as a political refugee who's Turkish is a Gulen member. So I would certainly want to make that clear to the audience, but some are, and it's very much tied to the attempted military coup in July 2016. I don't know about you, but for me, it was one of those moments of, you know, where were you on that day? Because we both follow Turkish politics so closely. And I was just, you know, for you, wondering, where were you on the 15th of July, 2016?
I was, okay, so not funnily, but the British consul in Istanbul was holding his leaving party that night. He was moving on to another assignment. I was going to go and actually was really ill that night. I wasn't feeling very well at all. So I was at my home in Kadıköy, which is on the Asian side of Istanbul. And I was really in like quite a lot of pain with my stomach. So I went for a walk along the Corniche. So for anyone who knows Istanbul, sort of around Moda Corniche and near the, it's called the Moda Deniz Klubu. It's a sort of members club. It's a sort of old Istanbul institution. And as I got near, it's about sort of 8:30 at night, and I thought, there's a lot of helicopters about, which wasn't so unusual for that time. I mean, it was generally a time of quite great chaos in Turkey generally. There had been a lot of terror attacks. There was a really big security presence on the street. So it wasn't that unusual for there to be helicopters, but I sort of looked at it and thought, it's a lot of helicopters. And then I got home and messages started coming through on my phone, mostly from other journalists. And you say things like, there's fighter jets flying over Ankara, the bridge has been blocked, what's going on? And then within a few hours it emerged actually the helicopters that I'd seen had come to kidnap, I think it was the heads of the army and navy from the Moda Deniz Klubu, where they'd been attending a kind of military society wedding. So that's what had been going on there. But yeah, I mean, that night it was chaos. I mean, no one sort of really knew what was going on. We were getting kind of bits and pieces of information from all over. It became clear quite quickly that it was a coup. And then, you know, things started falling apart quite quickly. You know, generals started coming on the television saying, we have nothing to do with this. And then obviously Erdoğan, after, you know, not knowing where he was for quite a few hours, then he did his live address to the nation. But it was quite difficult to sort of figure out what was really sort of behind it in those first hours. I think the first suggestion that it was Gülenists behind it, I think came quite early on. I think it was Binali Yildirim, who was Prime Minister at that time, gave a statement before Erdoğan gave his. And I don't think he used the word Gülenists, but he said something like this, you know, this is an attempt from a part of the military to take over the country, and it's not the whole military, and et cetera, et cetera. But certainly by the time that Erdoğan had landed back in Istanbul and had come out onto the tarmac to speak to the people, and by that time, you know, the coup had almost been crushed, he was openly saying that it was the Gülenists behind it, and the roundups started instantly. You know, within a few hours, thousands of people had been arrested, ringleaders had been paraded on television. You know, the narrative was set very, very quickly from the government's point of view. And, you know, as a journalist, it became quite difficult very, very quickly to really question that narrative. I mean, I remember I went to a round table with Ibrahim Kalin, who's Erdogan's spokesman. It was on the Tuesday, so that was 4 days after the coup. And he was, you talking us through what happened that night, and then obviously opened up for questions. And one of the other journalists asked him about the kind of speed of the arrests and the scale of the arrests. And Callan banged his fist on the table and he said, this is like questioning the US about its foreign policy the day after 9/11. And that was shut down. So, you know, I certainly got the sense that there was a narrative that the government wanted, and, you know, quite quickly we were not allowed to question, or if we did question that, we would be shut down quite quickly.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, evidence that, or narratives that have emerged since then. I don't want to say evidence because there's been so little in the way of, you know, open court cases or, you know, proper court cases. It's quite, you know, I always feel like I'm sort of grasping at air when I try and build a picture of what happened, because there's so little solid evidence to grasp at. But certainly it does seem that there was a guileless element at the centre of the coup attempt. Certainly it wasn't the whole military by any means that tried. It was a kind of caucus within the military. A leaked European Union intelligence report suggested that it was guileless at the centre, and that there were other kind of opportunistic groups that gathered around it, you know, other sort of groups in the military that weren't guileless but wanted to get Erdogan out, gathered around it. But for me, the main kind of issue is whatever, you know, accusations there are against the Gülenists, which may not be true, and certainly the Gülenists were a real thing and are a real thing. The problem is that there's been no fair hearing of what happened. There's no kind of you know, process of rule of law for the people who've been accused, and I would say that is the kind of main problem at this point. There's hundreds of thousands of people who've been arrested or charged, or in some cases, you know, are in prison awaiting charge, and there's no kind of due process for them.
Because the attempted coup, it was the pinnacle of a lot of infighting between the Gulen movement and the government. You mentioned earlier the corruption charges, that period in December 2013. It was all playing out in front of us. And I had thought when Zaman was closed, I thought, well, you know, this is it. I mean, there's the Gulen movement is finished, and this will never come up again. And then all of a sudden you had this attempted coup, which took so many by surprise, even though in the media in the months preceding there had been a lot of talk about a potential coup. It happened, and since then it's there have been so many myths built around that coup, whether it was a false flag coup, control coup, real coup. I mean, you must counter this all the time. I agree, it's like grasping for air in many cases.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think, you know, the idea that it was a completely false coup is just, no. I mean, you know, I've been a journalist for quite a long time, and one thing I've learned is that people always leak. You know, this is a thing where people sort of talk about, you know, 9/11 false flag. I would say it's impossible to plot something of that size and not have a single person leak. People are gossips by nature. So, and yeah, I mean, having been in Istanbul on that night, it was very real. I think the explanation that I've found most convincing, and I think there's most evidence pointing towards, is of a controlled coup. So the idea that you know, the security services, the intelligence services knew about this several hours at least before it unfolded. They've actually said this themselves, and also quite recently the Greek government said that they had passed on information of a coup that was about to unfold several hours in advance. So yeah, the kind of the theory is that the government knew about it, they let it unfold in order to then have this raison d'etre to do the roundups afterwards. And certainly this was also mentioned in the European intelligence report. They say that Erdogan's government already had lists of kind of dissidents ranging from Gezi Park activists to Kurdish activists to leftists to Gülenists who they wanted to round up, and basically the coup gave them the reason to then go ahead and round these people up. And what's really interesting actually is that immediately afterwards the initial roundups were suspected Gülenists, but now it's rippled out, and the people most recently who've been targeted are Gezi Park people. So over the past year, we've seen an increasing number of charges brought against people for Gezi Park and trials started. So I think, at this point, it's kind of rippled out. And in a weird way, by doing that, it's kind of brought together all these groups who actually didn't have much in common before. It was sort of one of the things that was, really keeping them from being able to challenge Erdogan successfully, is that there were so many fractures in the opposition. But actually now, because they're all sort of in the same boat, it's in a weird way brought them together.
Yeah, exactly. I'm surprised even now when I pick up a Turkish newspaper and I see that people from the Gezi Park period are being arrested, but also serving officers, all 40, 50 at a time, serving retired military officers still being picked up. And it makes me wonder about the cohesiveness of the Turkish military, and especially a military that we see is engaged from one corner of the Middle East to the other corner of the Middle East. And speaking from a military perspective, I can't imagine how they're holding it all together when they have troops in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Qatar. You still have to be concerned about the threat from the PKK inside your own country. And then you look over at the desk beside you and you see people being arrested and taken away. I really don't know how they're keeping it all together. And I also am concerned about the potential for conflict in the region. We were speaking about the Mediterranean earlier on. And I think at the moment, though, it's in the Turkish government's best interest to not see any of these conflicts or lose control of any of these conflicts in the Mediterranean. In your book, you write, and I'll quote, you say, to write and to live under Erdogan's tightening authoritarianism is to cohabit with a voice in your head that asks, are you sure you want to say that? ? End of quote. And we know that since the attempted coup, many media outlets were closed or taken over, and journalists were arrested, and many still sit in jail, and social media is under the microscope all the time. And I'm wondering, you're there in Istanbul, is there anything resembling an opposition media in Turkey today?
It's a complex question. I'll deal with sort of how censorship in Turkey works first off. So first of all, I should say, as a foreign journalist, I'm definitely in a privileged position compared to journalists of Turkish citizenship. Even dual nationals who work for international newspapers have really been targeted. In a lot of cases, I've written about the same story and they've been targeted and I've not, and it's clearly because I have the sort of protection, the benefit or the privilege of having a British passport. But even so, for all of us, there are red lines. The problem is, and the effective way that they control us, is we never quite know where those red lines are. They're always shifting. There are some that are always there and that you sort of learn to work with as a journalist in Turkey. So when it comes to reporting on the PKK, particularly since 2015, when reporting on the Gülenists, there's certain language that you have to use and certain things that you have to be very careful in the way that you phrase it so that you're not appearing to be supportive in any way. On other things, you always get the feeling that the red lines are shifting, and that takes up quite a lot of your brain power in always sort of second guessing yourself, which is what I'm sort of getting at when I wrote that in the book. I think people think that, you know, censorship is a clear set of rules. You can write this, you can't. It's not. It's, you know, this constant, you know, feeling of, am I stepping over the line? Should I write that? Should I phrase this differently? And it takes up a huge amount of energy when you're sort of thinking about every word you write and how it might be perceived. And particularly when, you know, obviously you have the Turkish government on the one hand, and the Department of Communications, Directorate of Communications, which gives us our press cards. But then you also have, you know, a troll army on Twitter who, if you sort of put one word wrong, will come down on you. So yeah, so there's all these kind of different pressures. Now, in terms of if there's an opposition media, there is, but I mean, it's been forcibly shrunk over the past 5 years. So a huge number of, you know, TV stations and newspapers and magazines have been shut down, or they've been taken over by businessmen who are loyal to Erdogan. And the ones that are left, and I would say this is the biggest problem, aren't particularly good. What tends to happen is, because they are the opposition media, they end up shoved into this position, shoved into this corner where all they feel they can do is just shout against Erdogan. So they just become these kind of like marginal opposition voices. And what's really lacking is investigative journalism, is investigative reporting. You know, the kind of reporting that could reveal how rich Erdogan and his relatives and friends are, or, you know, could reveal exactly what's going on inside the military. You know, this is what's lacking. It's not enough just to have a couple of newspapers and one TV channel that are, you know, shouting against Erdogan, because who's it going to persuade? The only people who are going to take notice are the people who don't like Erdogan anyway. You know, and actually the interesting thing is, this is not just something that's happening in Turkey, it's also happening in a lot of countries in the region as well. So particularly in the Balkans, in places like Serbia, places like Bulgaria, Hungary, you know, what's being squeezed out isn't necessarily, you know, journalists who are still willing to say rude things about Erdogan or Orban or Vučić. It's the journalists who, maybe they have a political line, maybe they want to say rude things in private, but that's not what they're about. What they're about is investigations. That's the really, really toxic thing that's going on in the media here.
Oh, thanks for that. And to our audience, now don't forget, if you do want to ask a question, you can by just scrolling to the bottom, and you'll see the Q&A section, because Hannah and I are really motoring along here, and we want to make sure that if you do have questions, we can touch on them. While we're waiting for anyone who has a question for you, Hannah, I'd like to talk about elections in Turkey, because the current government's been in power since 2002, and they have gone from election success to election success, sometimes by a slim margin. And more recently, we have seen the AKP, MHP, the two parties come together as the People's Alliance to hold things together. But I think the real story, the real recent story of elections in Turkey were the municipal elections in 2019, with Ekrem İmamoğlu winning in Istanbul, first by a slim margin in March 2019, and then when they reran that election, he won by a massive margin. I think for a lot of people who watch Turkey, they were actually quite surprised that many of the cities went to the opposition. I know there's more to it than that. And I'm wondering, as we look forward now to 2023 in national elections in Turkey, do you think that the AKP party and President Erdogan might be wondering if this is an election they can win? Would they be concerned?
I think certainly, and you know, if you look at some of the measures that Erdogan and his party and their allies in the MHP have suggested over the past few months, drawing up laws to bar newly formed parties from running. So, I think the thing that might be spooking there is that some former real heavyweights from Erdogan's party, Davutoglu, the former prime minister, and Babacan, the former deputy prime minister and economic expert, forming their own parties. They're not the only ones who've sort of moved away from the AKP. The AKP at this point is a kind of shell of itself, both in terms of, the sort of people at the top of the parliamentary party and also in terms of the base as well. And I think, even if Erdogan doesn't sort of know that in detail, there must be people in his party who do know that. I think it's important to say that Erdogan's electoral margins have never been massive. He's never, I think in parliamentary, the party never won more than 50% of the vote outright, 50% of the seats, yeah, but, he's never, it's not like Lukashenko in Belarus, like 80%. That's not what's happening in Turkey. Oh, are you still there?
Yeah, you were frozen for a moment, so.
Oh, sorry, my internet is not great. Where did you lose me?
About 20 seconds ago.
Okay. Erdogan's never had sort of stonking margins, and they've sort of been shrinking back towards that sort of vital 50% line since 2015, really. In the parliament, he's managed to get over that by forming this alliance with the MHP, which is just taking him over the 50% line in the parliament. And then, personally, he's clearly still the most popular and charismatic figure, but is he popular and charismatic enough to get over that 50% line? That's the question. And particularly, in this environment where the economy is going very badly and there are mounting crises on Turkey's doorstep.
Yeah, for sure. I watch it and I do wonder. When I was in Istanbul in November, I was walking in the Grand Bazaar, and every shopkeeper who came out to try to get me to come into their shop thought I was a Russian, and they were immediately launching into Russian. And that didn't happen a few years ago. And this comes to a question that we have from the audience on the state of Turkish Russian relations. Where do you see things going? Because thrown into that mix, of course, is that purchase of the S-400 anti-missile, anti-aircraft system as well, and everything that's going on in Syria. So what do you see there developing?
I think certainly it's this sort of Russia-Turkey or Putin-Erdogan relationship is not a relationship of equals. It's quite clear that, Putin has the upper hand. I think probably the only arena where the two have competing interests, where Turkey is doing better at the moment, is in Libya. So obviously Turkey's backing the Tripoli government against Haftar, Khalifa Haftar, the rebel general who controls a lot of the east, who Russia is backing, and actually Turkey's intervention has really turned things back in favour of the Tripoli government. But everywhere else, particularly in Syria, it's Russia that has the upper hand. And I think Putin's raising Rhetoric for trying to court Erdogan over the past 4 or 5 years is very much to do with sort of trying to create a tension at the heart of NATO, trying to, I think somebody in NATO put it, flip a member away from the alliance. I don't think there's any question that Turkey would leave NATO or that NATO would kick Turkey out, but certainly it's very useful for Putin to have this constant debate going on of how loyal a member is Turkey, how reliable a member is Turkey. I think what Russia's trying to do more broadly is to sort of win itself a place at the table as a kind of great power. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia went through this period of, obviously being in internal turmoil, in economic turmoil, not really playing a massive role on the world stage, or not really being able to protect itself on the world stage. So, when you look at the Balkan conflicts in the 90s, obviously Russia had a side, but wasn't, was very much behind the Serbs in Kosovo and in Bosnia, but wasn't able to, or didn't feel itself strong enough to sort of push that side on the international table. Now, how things have changed, right? You know, when you look at Syria, time and time again from 2011, it's been Russia primarily and also China that's been blocking resolutions and blocking action against Assad. And I think, you know, Putin wants to expand his influence even further. And, you know, really interestingly, Sergei Lavrov was in Cyprus yesterday, in the Republic of Cyprus. He went for an official visit to mark 60 years of diplomatic relations. And he offered for Russia to be a mediator in the conflict or in the dispute between Cyprus and Turkey. So the dispute over all kinds of things, but most pressingly about the undersea gas reserves in the Eastern Med. Now, I think this is a really good indicator of what Russia wants. It's also done a similar thing actually in the Serbia-Kosovo dispute. It's offered itself up as a mediator, sort of stepping into a role that 10 years ago we would have assumed the US or the EU would have taken. Mm. But look how disempowered both the EU and the US are at this point on the world stage. So I think, you know, everything that Putin is doing vis-a-vis Turkey is, you know, with the aim of trying to expand Russia's international role.
Yeah, I would think Turkey can often feel quite embattled at the moment with issues to do with Cyprus, with Greece, with Russia in Syria. And now they're watching Israel and the UAE establish ties, and this is impacting them in the region. I read recently that Qatar was Turkey's only friend in the region, and the relations with Iran are on and off again. How, you know, this whole relationship with Turkey and Iran, is this going anywhere? Are they going to be drawn closer in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's one really interesting story that I've been looking at over the past couple of months, which is that increasingly since the start of this year, Turkey appears to be detaining and deporting Iranian dissidents who'd fled to Turkey. So particularly people who've been involved in the anti-government protests in Iran last November. There was one guy in particular, he's sort of 22, 23 years old. He and two friends had got involved in some protests last November. They'd all been sentenced, or no, sorry, one of them had been arrested and sentenced to death. And this guy then decided, okay, I'm getting out of the country. He fled to Turkey, which is quite a sort of normal thing for Iranian dissidents to do. Either they can come with a passport without visa, or there are smuggling routes going over the border. And following a visit from Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. Oh no, sorry, it was a visit from Rouhani. It was a visit from President Rouhani. He met with President Erdoğan. Following that, this guy he'd already been detained in Turkey, he was then deported back to Iran. And that's happened several times that we know of. Some activists are saying there could be as many as 30 or 40 Iranian dissidents who've been deported back. So this is, you know, a sign that relations are, if not great, then are still going. And if you look at the sort of dialogue between Erdogan and Rouhani recently, it's been quite warm. They've talked about, you know, upping their cooperation in trade, in banking, which is really significant because obviously Iran is coming under increasing US sanctions. So the very fact that Turkey would talk about helping it out in its banking sector, I think is quite telling. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not, I wouldn't say it's a relationship based on love or, you know, mutual warmth necessarily. You know, they're historic rivals and will always be rivals in some senses. But I think, you know, at the moment they've got a lot of common ground.
The only time I saw all of the regional rivals coming together recently was after the referendum in the KRG on independence in 2017. Suddenly, everybody that had a beef with one another were actually now all on the same page.
Yeah,
absolutely. One question I have from the audience is about the AK Party itself, which often describes itself as a movement. And the question is it a movement? Is it something that will survive once President Erdogan does leave the scene? Is it a movement, or is there really going to be any significant change in Turkish politics, AK Party or not? I mean, these are broad questions, but the AK Party's been there for some time, and the question is it going to be a force for the future, or will it just move on?
I don't see how it can be. I mean, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the AKP today is unrecognisable from the AKP of 2 decades ago. It's not the AKP anymore. It's the Erdogan party. All those guys who initially founded the AKP and actually brought Erdogan on a bit later. It was men like Abdullah Gül, the former president, like Babacan. It was these guys who founded the AKP. And Erdogan was sort of brought on as a kind of charismatic, well-known figurehead. And, at this point it's the Erdogan party. I don't see how, as a party, it could survive beyond Erdogan. But more than that, as the idea of a movement, there's something really interesting. When I talk to people who are still, AKP supporters, they still use the language and the rhetoric of victimhood. They still talk, particularly when I talk to women of my age and older, so from the sort of mid to late 30s upwards, they still talk about things like the headscarf ban. They still talk about when, I went to university, I had to take my headscarf off, or I couldn't go to university. And it's bizarre because they've been in power for 20 years and they're clearly not the victims anymore. If anything, the victim has become the oppressor at this point. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you talk to younger conservative women who wear the headscarf, it's not even part of their thinking. This idea of, we were once oppressed because of this. They grew up in a different era. It doesn't even cross their minds that if Erdogan weren't here, that they might be forced out of the universities again. I think they have a sort of instinctive, knowledge that Turkey has moved on. And, although Turkey is a very divided country in many ways, I think this idea of a division between, pious people and non-pious people is in some ways a bit of a false one. I mean, it's one of the, few countries, well, maybe not a few countries, but certainly, when I look around Istanbul and look at, groups of, teenage girls, you'll always see, a group of girls and some will be wearing a headscarf and some won't. It's just not this kind of divided, victimized society that Erdogan likes to portray. So I feel like, and I'm sure this happens to all politicians who are sort of conviction politicians who, come to power on, riding on a movement. He's kind of out of ideas. I mean, when you sort of see him trying to connect with the youth these days, which he tries to occasionally, he looks like what he is, which is an old man trying and usually not succeeding to talk to people 1 or 2 generations below him. I don't think he's really got a handle on what, young people are thinking and wanting anymore in Turkey. Yeah,
I think we could say that too about quite a few people. I mentioned to one of my nephews that I said TikTok the other day, and he was absolutely shocked that I would know what that was. But you're right. Do you think the conversion of the Hagia Sophia, the Chora, the reconversion, is this part of it? Is it this search for an issue to keep the party at the forefront?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what Erdogan's thrived off, certainly in the time that I've been in Turkey, is crisis and opposition. He's not a politician who rules by bringing everyone together anymore. I mean, at some point, there's an argument that early on, whether cynically or not, that's what he tried to do. But certainly, in the era that I've been here, he's a politician who rules by either finding or creating a conflict and a divide and picking his side and rallying his people around that. Now, in some cases, as in the Hagia Sophia, it's an issue that, okay, probably not everyone in Turkey, in fact, definitely not everyone in Turkey was in favour of it or even particularly cared about it. But what you're going to get is the people who do care about it are going to show that they care about it by turning out in the hundreds of thousands for the first prayers. Whereas the people who are opposed to it, are they going to bother turning out to, oppose something that's being presented as like not only a religious but a nationalist triumph? No. Mm-hmm. So then the optics for Erdogan are, very easy for him to sell as, well, everyone's behind me on this. And of course, it provokes the expected reaction from Greece, which is always a good kind of old historic row to play on. One thing I would say, living in Turkey with this constant crisis or threat or row, it's exhausting, even for a foreigner, mm-hmm. It's exhausting. And for Turks, it's really exhausting. And I think at this point, this kind of rhetoric is wearing a bit thin. And, this is one of the things that actually propelled İmamoğlu to victory in the local elections last year, is that the CHP, his party, took a very deliberate strategy. I can't remember what they called it. It was something like the love campaign or something like that. It was a deliberate strategy to avoid this kind of divisive, bombastic, negative rhetoric and instead try and focus on, togetherness. So at some point, actually, during those local election campaigns, Erdogan, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he tried to imply that İmamoğlu was a closet Greek. He used unbelievable language. And İmamoğlu, rather than rising to it, just went, so what if I am? Greeks are part of the society as well. Mm. So, and, you can sort of see that paying off. So I think, although to a certain point there are always issues in Turkey which people will get behind or at the very least won't go against. So, things like the PKK, fighting against the PKK, support for the military, to a certain extent rows with Greece. I just think they're kind of wearing a bit thin. It's just exhausting to, mm-hmm. constantly get, roused up and angry.
I noticed we're just past 10 o'clock and I'm hoping you'll be able to just stay with us for a little longer, and thank you to the audience that's tuning in. We had a few questions come in. I'll just try to put it to it one last question, and that's really, I think, the most important part of any story, and that's the people, ordinary people. And we know in Turkey that the current economic situation, because of many factors, is not good. I watch the lira as it seems to get weaker day after day. And then, like many countries around the world, we're wrestling with COVID-19. And I think in Turkey, in particular, it's also been a real challenge. I hear from my friends in Izmir and Ankara what is happening on the ground. What is the mood like on the street?
In relation to COVID?
Just in general. Like, is there a mood? Is there a feeling about just where things are actually going? Because there's always the government narrative. Every government has a narrative, and then there's the reality playing out on the street. And I'm wondering if the two are in tandem. I don't think so, but if you are looking at elections in 2023, I think you'd have to be really, really worried.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the mood in the street is not what the government would like to project. The latest statement from Berat Albayrak, who's the economy minister, and also Erdogan's son-in-law, who's sort of taken this very optimistic approach to the economy. He's sort of appears on TV smiling and saying everything's fine when it's clearly not. The latest thing he's come out with is saying that you know, the weak lira is actually a competitive lira. Isn't it great? It means that Turkish exports will be, you know, through the roof. And, you know, okay, there's something in that, but for the, you know, people who are watching their currency get worth less and less, literally by the day, I mean, and, you know, all the kind of ripple out effects that come from that, particularly when, you know, the effect it's had on inflation. So, I mean, the big problem for Turkey is it imports most of its fuel and energy. So obviously, you know, when that's the case, any drop in the value of the lira is going to have a knock-on effect on everything. And, you know, the prices in the supermarkets just going through the roof. So, you know, for the average Turk, when you hear your economy minister saying things like this, yeah, it's not great. And I think, you know, there is a sense people know that things are not going well. Having said that, Turkey is a really complex country, and, you know, obviously I live in Istanbul, and the Turks who I sort of, you know, hang out with on a social basis are a certain type of Turk. You know, obviously when I kind of go out reporting, I'm trying to sort of talk to a cross section. That's not been particularly possible, or not as possible over the past few months. I've not been able to sort of travel around the country. I've sort of made an effort to, you know, still talk to different people. And one of the really interesting people who my colleague and I got in touch with was a lady who, she was a sort of diehard AKP supporter. She's very poor. She escaped a really bad marriage. She lived in a women's shelter for a bit. And she'd been an AKP voter pretty much all her life because the AKP were the ones who looked after her. And during this pandemic, she said, I got nothing from the government. Actually, it was the CHP local government in Istanbul who came to my help. They set up a scheme where my bills were paid for me when I couldn't pay anything. And, you know, they were the ones helping me out. So, you know, when it comes to the next election, will I vote Erdogan, actually? So, you know, this is one of the sort of main reasons why Erdogan was so reluctant to let go of Istanbul, because by controlling a city like this, you also have control to a certain degree of the kind of social welfare networks, the informal, should we say, social welfare networks, which are becoming increasingly important. So, you know, I think clearly there is a sort of, as the economy worsens and as the government's ability, or the AKP's ability to help people out who are in difficult positions, you know, grows less and less, I think the mood is changing. Having said that, what I'd be really interested to do as soon as possible is to travel to kind of deepest, darkest Anatolia, the sort of villages where these patronage networks that the AKP has built up over 2 decades are really, really strong, and to see what people in those kind of places are thinking, because, you know, this is a vast country. Istanbul's in some ways a kind of microcosm of the whole country, but in other ways it's also not. So yeah, it's difficult to say.
Well, I'm looking at the time. It's 10:10 here in Vancouver. And for those of you listening in that don't know, Hannah and I were chatting for 30 minutes on Zoom beforehand. So you've been a good soldier out there in Istanbul. And I'm envious of the fact that you are in Istanbul, because it's such a fun place to be. There were a few more questions, but we'll leave those for another time. I'd like to thank everybody that's taken part today, our CIC team members. And if you're interested in joining the Canadian International Council, just visit our website. We'd be glad to have you as new members. And Hannah, for my first webinar, it's been an absolute delight. I can practically say, knocking on wood, that nothing went wrong. So I'm now confident for the next time. And you've been an absolute delight. And the next time I'm in Turkey, we will have to sit down with some chai and
absolutely
talk about all of these things. Before I turn everything off here, is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I mean, it's my first webinar too, and it's really odd just sort of staring into a screen at one person and not being able to see who's out there. But thanks to everyone for coming. It's always really nice kind of chatting about a really, really interesting country.
Oh, terribly. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. All right. So I am going to press the end button here. And thank you again, everyone. Hannah, I'm sure I'll talk to you again at some point. Thanks for being such a wonderful guest today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.